Hello and welcome to Unplug Live. I am so excited. I know I say this, but this book, Good Stress, has changed my life. It's made me smarter. I have been listening to it and reading it. And the reason why I've been doing both of these things is because I love Jeff's voice. He cracks me up, but there's so much information in this that I literally needed to underline every single page and just write so many notes. I met Jeff early days when I opened up Unplugged. So that was in 2014. And he and his wife, Skylar, were the founders of the Wanderlust Festival and the Wanderlust Studio, and they gave me some great advice early days. And he has just been such an inspiration to me. For those of you who have ever learned anything about him, he has an incredible website called Commune, a great app where he interviews the top thinkers, spiritual healers, and mystics on the planet. And I could talk about him all day long. But the thing that I want to talk about is how this book not only has changed my life, but it's changed my mornings. This morning, I basically tossed my shoes because I didn't even realize I'm not supposed to be wearing shoes. I squatted as I finished this book. I did a cold plunge, a sauna, a cold shower, and I worked out, and I had Jeff's go-to breakfast, which is berries and yogurt and a walnut, I think. So I'm really proud of myself. So I want to welcome Jeff Krasno. Jeff, welcome to the Unplugged Live podcast.
Thanks so much. Great to be here.
So great to have you on. I mean, I have to say, I had no idea, A, how funny you are, and B, what an incredible writer you are. I don't read books that are books about, how to be a better human and just crack up 90% of the time as I'm learning technical terms, like the fox. Do you want to talk about the fox?
I could, if that's an appropriate topic for the moment. Yeah, I mean, more generally, health and wellness can be a Vesuvius of sanctimony, and for a good reason. I mean, most of us have journeys that are serious, but it can become just so heavy. So I think my goal here was to inject a little bit of levity into the conversation, and hopefully that makes the learning a little bit more palatable along the way. Yeah, I mean the FUCS. So that is a an acronym slash expletive, which is the four ubiquitous contemporary killers. We also know them as cancer, diabetes, heart disease, and stroke. No. Yeah, is that the one? I can't remember now. I've written this book 2 years ago. You just read it. That's no fair.
I know.
Um,
I just read the whole thing.
eh,
Before we get into the whole thing, I
yeah.
want to talk about your story, how
Sure.
you came to write this book, all the acronyms like Big Macs, SAD. There are so many great acronyms in this book, and what we can do to change our life in a simple way. And I know that you talk about chronic ease, or as we've been talking about here, being chronically comfortable. We all are chronically comfortable, so I definitely want to hit that note. And yeah, I would love for you to kind of talk about Fedge and
Mhm.
Jeff. And maybe we start there.
Yeah, so Fedge is my mythical hunter-gatherer ancestor, my great, 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 great times 600 grandfather, who lived, on the Serengeti in probably a tribe of 80 to 100. And, a good degree of stress, or what I might dub Paleolithic stress, was just a normal part of his life. So, as you noted in your preamble, Fedge did a tremendous amount of squatting. He didn't have comfy lazy boy chairs or couches, um, or stylish mid-century modern Eames chairs. He squatted, particularly around the fire at night, And, of course, we would find many of us would find that to be incredibly uncomfortable. But for Fedge, that engaged his muscles. It led to increased flexibility and mobility. And, this is a great example of an evolutionary mismatch, or what you're pointing to is how chronic ease really contributes to so much chronic disease. I mean, we spend most of our lives sedentary in chairs now, at these kind of angles, these 90-degree angles in our hips and our knees that we just simply weren't evolved or designed for. And it is these mismatches between the way that we live and the way that we are designed or engineered that often contribute to so many of our most prevalent chronic diseases, whether they be knee or hip pain or other chronic conditions like diabetes, et cetera. So this is, why I often use Fedge as my Paleolithic avatar, because it's a fun way to really compare the way that I live with the way that I was really designed to live. Um, and the more and more I unpacked Fedge, the more simple the equation became in terms of answering questions about how to be well. Because we get a deluge of information on social media and through other books and other media about, tips and hacks and everything like that. And my go-to is this. I ask myself, how did I evolve and how can I live in greater alignment with those conditions? And that will answer so many of your questions in terms of what are the best protocols and hacks and tips.
I love how in the beginning of the book you talk about your fantasy, which is you're living until 2088 with your wife. How, I don't know, remember how old you guys would be, 118 years old. And you're living, even though you've handled all of the obstacles and problems and deaths that have happened around you, you are living healthily and with a long health span, not just a long lifespan. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so I have three daughters, horrible, adorable, obstreperous, brilliant daughters. And back when, my bedtime was actually later than theirs, I used to read to them to sleep all the time. And this generally included many, many fairy tales of Brothers Grimm and whatever. And, often in these fairy tales, there would be a lowly scullery maid that would be granted some wish by some divine figure. And one night, my youngest daughter, Micah, she turned the tables on me and she said, "Now, Daddy, if you had one single wish, what would it be?" And of course, this flummoxed me for some time. And I was like, I have to ponder that. I went back to my Hans Christian Andersen or whatever it was. And by the end, I was like, I think I got it. I think I got it. And I created a little fairy tale in my head for her, which was in 2088, yeah, I would be 117, Skylar would be 118. We would be celebrating a centennial together, which is not unfathomable since we just clocked 37 years.
Wow.
Um, and we would take a long hike up to our little modest cabin and make a beautiful meal. And she'd read me off to sleep with the same old New Yorker article. And then somewhere in the middle of the night, both of our mitochondria would put one last plume of carbon dioxide up their energy producing chimneys, and we would die on the same day. And you know, on the surface, that might seem a little morose or morbid to tell your child that, but she didn't interpret that in that way at all. She thought she immediately understood that this is the beautiful way to die, that we, should not be limping through the last 20 years of our lives on cocktails of pharmaceuticals that just mask the symptoms of disease and never treat root cause, that we can actually, die young. And spiritually young. And that's a total possible goal, that our lifespan equals our health span, that that we can live full vital lives free of decrepitude and so many of the kind of artifacts of modernity, um, and thrive into old age. And this is, even though we used to die at a much younger age, I think in 1900 the average life expectancy was around 48. That, of course, that number was contributed to through a lot of childhood mortality and childbirth mortality. So people were living older, but generally, when people died, they died quickly. They would get an infectious disease, um, and there wasn't this extended kind of distension of morbidity, right? And so many of our what should be our elders have now become elderly.
Mhm.
And it has changed the way that we actually look at them, because we used to look at the older people in our society as these fonts of great wisdom, of accumulated experience that we would go to for advice and wisdom. And now, more often than not, they're shipped off to a nursing facility because, they're sick and they've become a nuisance to society. And so we're missing out on so much wisdom and knowledge. And obviously, there's the massive societal expense to a generation of people that are just limping through life. So that's my great dream, not just for me, but really for the world, is that we can live these full lives, and then die a very natural and normal death without pain and cognitive decline and decrepitude.
You talk also in the book about the difference between your chronological age and your biological age and how you measure the markers and how you compare it to a dashboard of a vehicle. Can you talk a little bit about that and what you do?
Yeah, sure. So your chronological age you have little control over. That's more or less just the orbits around the sun. And so I'm 54. I was born in 1970. That's my chronological age. But your biological age actually really looks at the health of your underlying tissues. And there's a lot of different ways to measure your biological age now. There used to be, we used to look at our telomeres, for example. We used to look at other biomarkers. Now we look at the hypermethylation of certain genes, et cetera, to measure our biological age. And when I kind of first started my health journey, when I was not healthy at all, my biological age was older than my chronological age. And over a relatively short period of time, I was actually able to turn that equation around. Now I'm biologically around 46, depending what measure you use. And um, and so this is a new and different way, to think about your age, not just as your birthdays, but the health of your underlying um, physiological organism.
And you talk about the car and how, when the lights go off in a vehicle, you would not waste more than 2 days to get your pressure fixed or something like that. Can you talk about like the wearables that you wear and kind of that part of your journey?
Yeah, I like that you say 2 days, because I am a bit of a procrastinator, as many people are. So your tire pressure light might go on your dashboard, and you might wait 2 days. Um, but if your check engine light went on, you'd probably go have it dealt with. And this, of course, this metaphor is applicable to your own vehicle, if you will. And you just get one lease on this one. But generally, we have no dashboard. And you'd never drive your car without a functioning dashboard. But we drive this vehicle around without a dashboard all the time. I mean, we go to our primary care physician once a year. If you're a man, you probably cancel it or postpone it, right? Because this is what we do. Um, but even if you go, you get a series of blood panels, and you just hope that you don't hear anything, right? And sometimes you do, and you've got to make some modifications. But I think what's interesting about, modern science and modern medicine, what it provides us, is really so many devices and wearables that actually do give you a dashboard into your own underlying health. And while I don't want to get too neurotic about my wearables, because that's its own issue, I do think that what you can measure, you can improve, and you can take greater degree of agency over your own health when you can see your own data day to day or even moment to moment. So what was key for me, I mean, I wear a Whoop. I have one here, and I wear an
What is
Aura
it?
ring.
What is it called?
So this is a Whoop, um, and
Uh-huh.
I have an Aura ring, which is most known for measuring sleep, but there's a bunch of other markers that go with it. But the biggest one for me, I'll see if I can actually roll up my sleeve high enough, is that I wear this little continuous glucose monitor, which is a disc that I put on my triceps. And at first, it can be a little bit harrowing for anyone who's scared of needles because there's like a little puncture that has to happen, but it doesn't hurt at all. And once you get it into place, this little disc will dutifully bounce uh, your metabolic data to an app on your phone. And really, what it's measuring is blood glucose levels moment to moment. And so, for me, 5 years ago, I discovered that I was diabetic. Um, and this came as a massive shock. And this device was really just so instrumental in my health turnaround because I could see how my behavior impacted my blood glucose levels. And through a sane approach to blood glucose management, I could actually correlate how I felt through developing my powers of interoception with the data that I was seeing. And that was incredibly helpful. And it was also cool just to know that blueberries spiked me, but rice didn't, or whatever. So you can play a lot of fun N-of-1 experimentation with yourself.
You talk also about how we're all 99% the same.
Yeah.
And the way that you described epigenetics versus DNA as a pianist, would love for you to share that. Don't you like how I know every single thing? I really read.
Yeah, I know it's pretty. I'm both humbled and impressed. Um, Yeah, I mean, we share 99% of the same DNA, and I generally apologize for that because I have a lot of flaws. Um, but yeah, I mean, we spent the last half of the 20th century um, very attached to this idea of genetic determinism. That, Watson and Crick and Rosalind Franklin discovered the structure of DNA, the double helix, in 1953 or so. And, we just became obsessed with this notion that if we could map the human genome, we could discover every gene that was responsible, for Susie's eye color, for her proclivities for every disease, for her behavior, for the fact that she liked too much coffee. I don't know, that we basically could reduce ourselves to our basic component building blocks and understand the nature of life. And that was a very intoxicating idea. And then we went off on this massive international scientific project, one of the greatest kind of international cooperations in science that have ever existed, called the Human Genome Project. And we did map the human genome. And we expected to come back with hundreds of thousands of genes because we're such incredibly sophisticated, complicated creatures. And we came back with a scant 22,300 genes. That's a good 8,000 less than a grape plant, about the same as a guppy, about the same as a pig, not too much more than a fruit fly, etc. So this was very confounding. How do Homo sapiens that are so evolved, how do we have the same amount of protein coding genes as a guppy? Um, so, and if you look around, the answer might be more clear than you think, or maybe we're not that much more intelligent than a guppy. Um, but this gave rise to what this emerging field of science known as epigenetics, which is it's not so much our underlying genes or our DNA, it's actually the expression of those genes. And epigenetics really codifies that idea that our genes express differently in relationship to our environment. And this kind of informs this whole idea of the exposome, all of the inputs of your life, from your relationships to your diet, to how you move, to environmental toxins, to clean air, to all of your behaviors, how they all impact the expression of your genes moment to moment. And so this is the new science that's so fascinating. And it really gives human beings so much more agency because our fates are not written in the stars of our genetics. Yes, at certain times, our genetics will predispose us to developing certain diseases, and I can give you a lot of examples of that. But more than not, it's really our environment that shapes our health and whether or not we're thriving. And that goes for all aspects of our environment. I mean, it's so interesting. There's this now field of study called sociogenomics that our social connections actually inform and influence our gene expression. So loneliness might actually hypermethylate certain genes and turn expression off, or turn certain genes on that we don't want on. But deep social connection might have the opposite impact. That's also true with this whole study of epinutrition, that there are certain adaptogens and other micronutrients that actually influence the expression of genes. So, I mean, I sometimes use that analogy of the piano player. So, epi means above, so above your genes. So that your DNA are those 88 keys that you sit there and look at on the piano. They never change, right? That's essentially the hand that you've been dealt. But you are the piano player, and that's really epigenetics. Which keys are you going to press down and express? And are they going to be harmonious or dissonant? And we know that a well-rested, well-nourished piano player plays better Debussy. But sometimes you sit down, as I do, on the keyboard that you might be able to see behind me, and when I'm not getting enough sleep, and when I've gone out on a bender, or I'm not eating well, or I'm not getting exercise, I'm just not going to express well. And that holds true for your genes as well.
And I like how in the book also you give us solutions. It's not like you're just telling us, here are the facts and this is what happens, but when you say loneliness is a huge epidemic, and then you quote all the research behind loneliness, you say, here are some ways to not be lonely. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
When someone calls you, pick up the phone, or spend 5 minutes of your day and connect with someone by picking up the phone and calling them. In real life is much more valuable than virtual life. And you say all these things in a point system at the end. You don't just do it for one. You hit all of these different things. So for instance, I talked about how this morning after reading your book, I took a cold plunge. Actually, I didn't take a cold plunge. I took a cold shower because there's no way I'm getting into one of those cold plunges yet. I'm not ready for that yet. But taking a cold shower for 3 minutes, is that the time you're supposed to do it for?
That's a good amount of time. You don't even probably have to
You
do it for
said
that
that.
long, but well done. Yeah, two
I
to
was
three
good. I was
minutes.
good for 60 seconds, just saying.
Yeah.
But I know now my goal is 3 minutes. But you talk about how when you wake up in the morning and you drink lemon water and then you jump into a cold plunge, that's actually a great way to burn fat too. And you talk about the beige fat and the white fat and the brown fat. Can you talk a
Yeah.
little bit about that?
Sure. So I'll just ground this in my own experience so I was about 210 pounds 5 years ago. That's about 50 or 60 pounds heavier than I am now. Um, so weight management was a big part of my transformation, and it was very related to blood sugar management. But I found one particular stack of protocols to be unbelievably effective at helping me lose weight. So I'll just kind of outline those very quickly. And again, everybody's different. Cold plunging and fasting, I think, are very bio-individual. So, like, they're different for women on their cycle. They're probably better in the follicular phase and not in the luteal phase. They're different for women in menopause, but all these things. But I'll just say this more as a general outline. Um, so, I adopted a 16/8 fasting protocol. That was very, very key for lowering my day-to-day blood sugar in conjunction with a keto focused diet where I was eating more protein and less carbohydrates. Because I
Just to
was,
interrupt you, when you say
Mhm.
16, that means 8 hours on, 16 hours off.
That's right. That's consolidating your consumption of food into a tighter window of 8 hours versus how we usually eat, which is we're grazing essentially from the moment we wake up until the moment we go to sleep, when we're honest with ourselves.
Guilty.
Yeah, yeah. So consolidating my consumption of food into a tighter window, eating more protein and healthy fats and way less carbs. So I was committing carbicide for many, many years. So I flipped that equation. And then before breaking my fast, so before my first bite of food in the morning, I would get into a cold plunge. And I started to see a tremendous amount of weight loss from cadencing those protocols in that particular way. And then I started to understand the mechanism at play. And for the geekier people here, they'll appreciate this, and I'll try to be short with it. But if you get into a cold plunge, outside from having a panic attack and gasping, there's other things happening to your physiology. Your core body temperature is plummeting, right? So your biology, my biology, everybody's here. We are engineered for homeostasis. So that's a certain amount of dynamic equilibrium in the body. Our body loves to be in that little Goldilocks zone of around 98.6. So during the day. So when your core body temperature plummets, you have to make heat to get back into that little warm porridge, right, of 98.6. And so your body, particularly the mitochondria in your cells, particularly in a specific kind of tissue known as brown fat, it starts to scan the savanna of your body for an energy substrate to actually make heat. And if you're fasted and you're not eating a lot of carbohydrates, there's simply not a lot of glucose around for your body to use to make heat. So it has no other choice except to opt for fat, for stored fat, triglycerides in your adipocytes, in your fat cells, and break those down into free fatty acids to use to heat your body back up. And so like I said, everybody is individual and different, but there are certain, I would say, general principles and mechanisms that apply to everyone. And that combination of low glucose levels through keto and fasting with cadencing a cold plunge before you break your fast, that will almost certainly have weight loss or weight management impacts for almost anyone.
How long are you in the cold plunge for? And what do you do when you're in there to not go into panic mode?
Yeah. So I'm in generally for 2 to 3 minutes. And this is a really huge point to make about cold because people just simply abhor the cold. And I'm one of them. I mean, the just staring at Lake Tahoe basically would turn me into Woody Allen. I'd just become like a neurotic old Jew really quickly. I just have a panic attack. Um, but I slowly just leaned into the edge of my discomfort. And this is key. You do not need to get into a 34-degree or a 40-degree or even a 50-degree cold plunge for it to have the beneficial impacts. Cold is extremely subjective. So you can actually get benefits from a 60-degree plunge. And, I think mine is 58, so it's not even really that cold. And I will get in generally for about 2 minutes. And over time, I have become slightly more impervious to it. But of course, that's the moment that you actually lower the temperature um, and extend duration because you don't want it to be comfortable. You want a little bit of discomfort. That's the entire point.
That's
Um,
the good stress.
that's the good stress because there's benefits in doing hard things. Um, and so, there, that's my protocol. It's around 58 degrees. It's a couple of minutes. I still have the same response, that involuntary stress response to getting into the cold. And I think everyone can relate to this. Right? You gasp and you feel that epinephrine coursing through your veins and it's coming up into your head and you feel like you might have a panic attack, right? But right at that moment, you have a space available to you to apply what I call top down conscious pressure on top of involuntary bottom up response. And you can generally do that by leveraging your breath, right? So you leverage a certain kind of breath that moves you back into your parasympathetic state. So there's many of those, which I'm sure you've taught many people for many, many years. It could be box breathing, it could be 4-7-8, but basically it's any breath where the holds are longer than the inhalations. And so by doing that, you actually create a certain amount of long-term overall emotional resilience that then spills over into the rest of your life, right? So I saw some questions that had been submitted earlier about like, well, how do I manage stress in traffic, for example? Well, this is like jumping into the ice bath of Highway 101 or the 405 or wherever you live. You will find that, yeah, being able to apply that conscious top-down pressure is very important while you're in the plunge, but actually where it's really truly useful is when you're not there. It's when you're at the dentist or when you're dealing with your children or when you're dealing on the 101. And that's when, these protocols have their most utility.
And for those of you who don't know, again, I kind of mentioned that Jeff has a place called Commune that is in Topanga. It is the most unbelievable place I've been in Los Angeles. And it used to be Neil Young's property, and you transformed it into this just, I don't even know how to describe it, but basically everything's sustainable on this farm slash property. But Wim Hof actually went there for 3 weeks. And in his 3 weeks, he was having people come daily to experience the cold plunge. And Wim Hof said to you that he hates the cold.
Yeah, yeah,
I
he
thought,
does actually. It's funny because I believe I asked him, where do you go for vacation? And he gave me an answer like, oh, the Caribbean or Mexico. And I was like, well, wait a minute, that's not what I expected. Wouldn't you go somewhere cold? He's like, Jeff, I hate the cold. Are you kidding? And his inimitable Dutch burr. Um,
and describe his feet too.
Yeah, well, he doesn't wear shoes. I mean, this was the humorous thing. So he stayed 3 weeks with his entire extended brood. Eventually, I was like, "Dude, you're out of here. You gotta leave." Um, and he was there, sort of holding court during the day, doing ice plunging, and he's got the kind of cult following, so it would be like Rick Rubin would tootle in, or Gwyneth Paltrow would tootle in, or whatever, and he would be like, "Okay, Gwyneth, now you get into the ice, and you do the breath, and we do the horse dance, or whatever," and then he'd wear these impossibly short shorts. I mean, the shortest shorts they didn't even qualify as shorts, and no shoes, and then he'd get picked up every day by like an Escalade, but he wouldn't change. And he'd run off to a meeting at Netflix or whatever in these tiny short shorts with no shoes. So we went on a number of different hikes, and those trails up there are pretty rugged, and he would not wear shoes. And his feet looked like Sasquatch, right? They're like super wide, super thick, and he had unbelievable balance. And he had built up a certain amount of resilience through leaning into adversity, right? it's not that he didn't feel the ground. He probably feels the ground much more than anyone that encases their foot in vinyl or plastic or high heels, etc. He actually uses all of those um, neurons on the bottom or sensory neurons on the bottom of his foot. Um, but he has built up a certain amount of imperviousness to pain, really, and it was quite amazing. He was really my first introduction into a lot of these protocols, and he's just a joyous human being too.
One of the things you say at the end of your book is you talk about how older people, one of the biggest issues that they have is falling. And
Hmm.
and we know that once they fall, sometimes the recovery is just a downward spiral. And that
Yeah, it
happens
doesn't
to a
happen.
lot of older people. But balance is also these shoes that we wear are ruining our balance. And that by actually walking barefoot, we're going to be improving our balance.
Yeah, I mean, I think anyone who has broken an arm can relate to this. If you break an arm and you have to wear a cast, what happens to those muscles in your arm while you're wearing that cast? Well, of course, they atrophy. And the same thing is really happening with our feet. We wrap them in ostensibly casts, these massive slabs of plastic and vinyl. And then what happens? Yeah, our foot muscles and everything going on, our ligaments, our tendons in our feet and our ankles, they just simply atrophy. And you're right, you can kind of get away with that, when you're in a more midlife or early life. But as you get older, you fall, and that all-cause mortality after you have a fall and, break a hip or something is quite severe. So this is why, I think we all need to be more barefoot or simulate some degree of barefootness in our lives to really leverage this biomechanical masterpiece of our foot and our human body in general. each foot has 26 bones. And so I think there's 206 bones in the entire human body. So just in our feet, 52 bones, right? Quite amazing. Like hundreds of muscles, 26 joints, I believe, hundreds of thousands of sensory neurons. And so when we wrap our foot up and we essentially mute all of that, we're losing so much. And then, and then we get bunions and corns and we sprain our ankles and all of these different, you know, um, presentations that we never had, on the savannah or on the Serengeti when we used to wear very minimal shoes made of like sage bark or reindeer hooves or, where depending where we evolved. So I try to go barefoot a little bit every day. I try to squat every day, and then I wear these barefoot shoes. I'm partial to this one brand called Vivo Barefoot. They basically have big toe boxes, so they keep your toes splayed, and they have very, very minimal soles, so you're really feeling the ground, and they're super flexible. So I'm very partial to those, and they tend to be stylier than they used to be. I remember when Vibram first came out with those, where they treat your each toe like a finger, and they weren't that cool, but the new ones look pretty slick.
You also talk about heat and how that affects the body. And like we were saying before with cold plunge, if you don't have access to a cold plunge, you can take a cold shower. You said the same thing with heat. If you don't have access to a sauna, you can buy one of those blankets that wrap around you and make you look like you're a hot dog in a bun.
Yeah, little corn dog. Um, yeah, I mean, again, we evolved in relationship to a lot of heat and cold, right? This was just the normal way of living. The temperatures, you know, as we lived for hundreds of thousands of years of Homo sapiens on the savannah would get extremely hot during the day and extremely cold at night. And we have mechanisms to deal with that. When we get cold, we shiver. When we get hot, we sweat. Um, but now we're finding through a tremendous amount of clinical data largely organized by a woman named Dr. Rhonda Patrick, who's a wonderful doctor who has done this kind of meta studies, aggregating all the data from Finland, that getting deliberately hot has all of these other benefits. So anyone that has been in the sauna knows that their heart rate increases a little bit. So it essentially simulates some degree of aerobic exercise. And the cardiovascular benefits of being in the sauna are quite incredible. The data is amazing there. And then it also stimulates all the production of all of these other amazing proteins and molecules. So there's one that gets talked about a lot in biohacking circles called brain-derived neurotrophic factor, BDNF. So actually getting in the sauna stimulates the production of that particular protein molecule that upgrades neural function. So it actually maintains the kind of your little electrons going across your synapses in your brain, but it also helps you grow new neurons even later in life. And of course, this was something that was anathema even 15 years ago. We used to think that at 25, we basically just entered into this slow cognitive decline and we couldn't grow new neurons. But this is actually turning out not to be true, that we can actually grow new brain cells later in life. And one of the contributing factors or molecules to that is this BDNF that we can stimulate from being in the sauna. Also, kind of going between hot and cold, really great for your circulatory system because when you get hot, your blood vessels open. It's a vasodilator. When you get cold, they constrict, and we know that because a lot of athletes get into the cold after a workout to reduce inflammation, so that vasoconstriction. So by going back and forth, you get this accordion effect of dilation, constriction, which moves your blood around your circulatory system, and your lymph starts to move around a lot more. So there's so many reasons, I could spend like hours just talking about heat and cold.
I love when you say, put on your geek belts. Okay. I mean, I
Yeah,
did put on my geek belt on this
yeah,
because I learned so much from this book. And I'm not going to give everything away because at the very end of the book, Jeff shares his protocol, what he does on the perfect good stress day. But you know what? You're going to have to get the book for that because I want you to read this. I want you to understand about the Big Macs, the big modern American conveniences. I never heard that before. I love that. How we
yeah.
change our thermostat to be the perfect temperature. We don't suffer ever if we don't have to, and that's actually causing us pain. So we have a lot of questions that we have to answer. But
Great.
for those of you who are looking at this is the book, I highly recommend not only buying the book so you can underline every single thing, but listening to it too, because but I can actually, I realized something as I was listening and reading this is I actually read faster than I listen. And I had you at 1.2 speed. I have to be honest. And yet I still read faster. So I was happy about
Good,
that.
good for you. Way to go. You're one of the few left, I think, that can
Well,
maintain that much concentration.
only because it was interesting, because I have, ADHD just like the next guy. All right. Let me find Jelena, can you ask the first question? Because as I'm looking for it, I see it.
Sure. Let's see.
I found it just in case.
Yeah, want to pick one of the top three?
Sure. How do you handle a constant daily loud noises from the children living above your unit?
Yeah, not something that I wrote about in the book. Um, yeah, well, I'm not going to say that you just need to witness the sound non-judgmentally moment to moment. I'm not going to give you that answer, even though I'm tempted to on the Unplugged podcast. Um, I mean, yeah, life is going to throw annoyances and stressors at you no matter what, right? So there's a certain amount of mindfulness and breath work that you can engage in um, to minimize the degree of annoyance, but still it's there. So it's not, we can't deny that it's there. And yeah, you could probably wear headphones and earplugs, so there's some probably practical solutions to that particular problem.
Mhm.
But I think this is where, maybe go upstairs to your neighbor and have a hard conversation. That's another part of the protocol, is actually leaning into the conversations that you would otherwise naturally avoid, right? Sometimes I call this like jumping into the ice bath of hard conversations, and just be compassionate and honest. They have children, they're probably living their own stressed life, but maybe there's an option for you to offer to split the cost of buying a rug or some thick padding that might go under a rug, right? Perhaps there's a way for the kids to be confined in one room for a certain period of time when, you're trying to practice or you're writing or something. So I think, this is a place where we need to cultivate cooperation and common ground, and not just brood and hold the ember of resentment.
And I think actually, that last chapter of your book where you talk about becoming a rock
Hmm.
and being a meditator, you have a whole section on meditation, which I thought was brilliant. But when you meditate daily, little things stop bothering you as much. And you also realize you get to hear that noise upstairs, as opposed to all the people who don't get to hear that noise upstairs because they're no longer with us. So, there's different ways to look at that.
Yeah.
Um,
Stoicism.
I love the
Yeah.
whole section on stoicism. I love how you deal with difficult people, and and I loved how there's just so much in this book. Please, you have to read it. I can't point out every little thing. Okay. Um, when you have a good stress day, what does that look like for you?
Yeah, I mean, describing it won't sound particularly stressful, probably, but I have a certain non-negotiable agenda for myself. I get up early and I immediately get outside within the first 5 or 10 minutes of waking up. And, you know, I do this for a number of different reasons. First, it's a way for me to set my intention where, most of my day is focused on my attention, where I'm kind of shining the spotlight of my conscious awareness. But this is a time where I can really develop my intention and stretch inward such that my intention becomes my attention. It's also a time where I get, positive blue light because I set my circadian rhythm in the morning. So again, we were evolved to get a certain amount of light in the morning because we woke up and we were generally outside, or we lived in very, small huts, etc. And this interrelationship between light actually is very, very influential on setting our circadian rhythm. So without getting too geeky again, we have these sensory neurons in the inferior part of our retina that sense this blue light and that modify our endocrine system such that we produce melatonin in about 14 hours. So it's quite useful if you're having trouble sleeping to get out and get morning light. It's also just an opportunity to witness nature and to be grateful to be part of this greater life experiment. I'm lucky enough to live up in the hills, and so I'm sort of bathed in nature. So this is my way that I start my day. Then I get very deliberately hot and very, very deliberately cold, and and that's sort of a non-negotiable practice. And then I'm generally on a fasting protocol, which resembles 14-10 or sometimes 16-8. I don't get too fundamental about it, but I try to be conscious of not stuffing my face all day long and just giving my body an opportunity to repair and restore and not just grow. And then obviously I have like a movement protocol. I get in the gym, I'm sort of a closeted gym rat, if you will. I love going to the gym. I listen to a lot of books and podcasts in the gym. So I generally walk 5 or 6 times a day, uh, you know, 10 to 15,000 steps, and then I lift plenty of heavy things. And yeah, I cook mostly all my food, We grow a lot of food here. Um, we sprout and we kraut, and my wife makes amazing seed crackers. And we have 4 chickens, and we have bees, and I'm very, very lucky to have all that stuff in my life that allows me to maintain a pretty good diet. So that's kind of most of it.
I love that. Is there anything that you feel like I didn't share that you would like to share with everybody? I just want to make sure I get ahead of that.
Yeah, we often get very caught up in the tactics of being well and the protocols, and a lot of people just are like, well, tell me what the fuck to do. I just want to do the thing. And sure, I totally get that, and tactics are important. But for me, and I think for many people that I talk to, there's a shift that needs to happen prior to adopting the tactics. And a lot of that goes to the stories that we tell ourselves about ourselves. And, for me, in order to actually transform my health and be well, I really had to do a very personal inventory of who I thought I was, sort of a psychosocial intake form, if you will, because I grew up as a perpetual people pleaser. I was an extremely overweight kid that was traveling from country to country, always trying to kind of fit into new cliques in new countries and new schools and new languages. And that had its wonderful sides. I learned a lot of languages as a kid, but it had some very, very difficult sides too. You know, I I really was committed to sacrificing any authentic component of myself in order to fit in. And that really led to this kind of disease of people pleasing. And I didn't really wake up to that until, I was 49 or 50. I was essentially totally anchored to my story that I was just this fat kid that would never really fit in, and that, my fate was written in the stars of my genetics. And I had to awaken to honestly this Buddhist notion that we are totally and completely impermanent. And that is also true about our stories. That, the Buddha had this revelation under the Bodhi tree 2,500 years ago that everything in the universe, including Suze, including me, including everyone listening, is just always in flux, always changing. So craving or clinging to any one thing is totally futile and the source of a tremendous amount of suffering. And as I started to learn more about human physiology, I saw the metaphysical truths of the Buddha patterned everywhere in the physical. I started to look inside under the hood of my body and realize that no, I am not this story. I am 7 octillion atoms experiencing 37 billion chemical reactions every second of the day. I am simply not the same person that started this conversation with you 40 minutes ago. And this was a huge awakening that change is not only possible, but it is actually the only thing on offer. All we are is change. And when we actually deeply embrace that idea, it provides a lot of agency, a lot of empowerment. Because if I am just changing moment to moment in relationship to my environment, then I have some agency over creating my environment and adjusting my behaviors such that I'm healing, such that I'm actually moving towards wholeness and away from disconnection and disease. So I think that's the biggest learning that I had in thinking about this book and writing it, is the full and total embrace of change.
Again, this is the book, Good Stress. And I want to thank you so much, Jeff, for coming on the show. We're going to be sending this out far and wide. For those of you who have any questions or want to meet Jeff, feel free to show your face. Doesn't need to just be behind the screen. Put your cameras on, say hello. We'd love to say hello to you. Jeff, thank you. How can people get in touch with you if they want to get in touch with you?
Yeah, well, I'm actually very available. I put my email out everywhere. It's jeffk@onecommune.com. So you can just send me a note. I do wax alternately poetic and pathetic on the old Instagram. So I'm just at Jeff Krasno. But if you want to discover really the true brilliant minds from which I've distilled a lot of this knowledge, just head to Commune because that's where, I've learned everything, through interviewing so many fantastic, brilliant people, including yourself, and so many of the amazing doctors and spiritual leaders that I've so admired. So that's the repository of the great wisdom over there.
Wow. Well, thank you all so much for staying with us, for watching, and I'm so excited to share this with so many people. I think everybody could learn from this book, and I'm not just saying that. I want to hug it. I want to hug it and tell it, I love you. I love you. I learned so much from you. Like, I just appreciate when someone takes the time to share so much wisdom that actually will improve my personal life. This book and the other book I was telling you about, Arate, those two books, you guys are my inner voice now. So thank you.
Thank you so much. Love connecting with you and your amazing community.
Thank you. Bye. Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Thank you.